Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for part 3 of the rebuild of 322, the Hudson 464 steam locomotive from American Flyer Trains from about 1947. Stay tuned. This session will focus on the disassembly and describe the disassembly of the locomotive to include the chassis and the motor, and talk about some discoveries I made, some changes I'll be making on this locomotive, and immediate next steps for this project. I've also been requested to discuss and maybe demonstrate, although it's already separated, the separation of the chassis from the boiler and then the disassembly of the motor. We'll do that briefly. The root cause for this level of detail work is actually twofold. One is to replace this driver wheel, and the other is to paint the boiler and the tender. Well, first, the wheel. What Jason G articulated and reminded me is that the metal used in these rims is a zinc tin alloy. And what the root problem was is that it probably wasn't so much the rim as it was the fact that the plastic in the wheel shrank. Now you'll remember that 1946-47 was kind of an infancy year for plastics, and you'll recall a lot of the 1946 trains even point out that you'll see warping in the hoppers, cabooses, maybe boxcars along the roof line, because they did not have a full grasp of the plastics. And that's what happened here. These shrank and the rims began to slip on the wheel. When they slipped on the wheel, they decided to try to stop that movement of it rotating on the plastic by inserting these pins through the rim into the plastic. Got two of them on this one that I'm aware of. Now on these others, there's actually maybe as many as four, one large and a pair of large and a pair of small. Now according to Jason G, the larger pins caused this to fracture. And that makes sense. You're driving a pretty good sized pin into a small rim of metal. And that the smaller pins did not encourage the fracturing of these rims as much. And hence, this is what you get. I just hope this is the only one I have to replace. I only have one spare wheel, and I don't want to have to go through this over and over again, so I hope the remainder of the rims on this train stay together. This one disintegrated finally, and it was probably because of fracture points at the location of the pins. I was asked to elaborate on the separation and how to disassemble both the chassis from the boiler and then the motor. Well, first of all, the first thing I do is I separate the tender, and that's usually done by simply disabling a screw on this bar right here that spans across the base of the cab area. So go ahead and get the tender set aside if you're going to focus strictly on the boiler. The next thing is I go ahead and separate things like the trailing truck, again held on with one screw, and then the pilot, which is actually made up of two components. And then I separate, if possible, the pilot wheels structure, truck structure, from the actual pilot itself. Set those aside. And then I focus on the remaining pieces of the four-piece boiler. Now, if you don't have a four-piece boiler, you're not going to have this many pieces. The boiler will be one piece, and that includes the steam chest and the front cover. So I set those aside. Once that's accomplished, I'm ready to remove the chassis and also, because it'll be attached to it, the reverse unit and the motor. I'm showing you them in this video already disassembled, and we'll discuss how that's done. The chassis, to remove it, is going to have 6 contact points. 2 in the back, which are not really structural. These 2 motor mount brackets right here, and then 2 more motor mount points right here that are held in by screws. Now the first thing I do is take the screws out of this jack panel. Again, it's not supporting weight. You just simply need to remove it because the wires are attached to it. Now another possibility, of course, is to separate these solder points. I prefer not to do that. So I simply separate the screws and pull this back through this opening right here and then set it in here. I then take these two screws out right here, and then you're ready to slide the chassis a little bit forward to separate it from this mounting point here, which fits, the slot in this fits on this motor mount bracket. Now, it's intuitively not going to appear to be able to be done to slide the chassis forward inside the boiler, because the lever for the reverse unit is in that narrow slot right there. But just keep working at it, it'll work. And eventually you'll get this and this disabled, which means then you can pick up the back end of the motor, slide it out further, and then completely remove it, because you've got to get this headlamp support bracket cleared of the bottom of the boiler in order to remove it. So at that point, you've disabled 4 screws, 2 in the back, which are non-load bearing, and then 2 up here that are. And if you're uncomfortable with managing the inventory of the screws, what my methodology is to take detailed photography at multiple angles. When you remove something as small as a screw, simply tape it to the photograph from whence it came. Helps you manage it. All right, now at that point, I've got the chassis separated, but at that point, the reverse unit and the motor are still attached to the chassis. Now at this point, it doesn't matter if I'm going to do any detailed disassembly of the reverse unit or not. In this train, I am not, because I've completed that, I've checked it, it seems to be an extremely good working order, and I just don't want to mess with something that's working really, really good, and the brushes are in, the fingers are in very, very good condition. But I begin the separation simply by removing one screw right here that holds this bracket in place, and then the other screw goes into a slot. So that means I just take the reverse unit, pull it forward just a little bit, lift it up, and it's free. At this point, you do not want to overhandle it, because you have the potential then of bending these wires, these single-stranded wires that go to the field, and that is not something that you want to separate. It's not that they're not repairable, they're just not a lot of fun to do, and you want to leave it in the best condition possible. Now, to remove the motor, it's simply a matter of removing these 2 long screws right here that hold the brush bracket assembly on, which holds the armature, which holds the field on the back of the chassis. And that's it. Once these 2 screws are out, it's all ready to come off. Now you'll want to kind of hold this as a single unit and lift it back to get it off of these pins right here, because that's what supports its weight. These pins go into one side of the field. Pull that straight back and up, and then you should have this whole assembly right here free of the chassis, and you can set it aside. At that point, you can twist the armature out and set it down. You've got the brush bracket assembly separated, and then of course you've got these screws. Now the brush bracket assembly I have sitting here is not the one that originally came in here. The original one is this one. And you'll probably recognize it. You probably have some trains that have this particular type of contact point for the brushes on the brush bracket assembly. And these are called lever type for early steamers brush bracket assembly. And it has these early type lever contact points right here. Now the thing that's different, of course, is that when you remove the motor, this piece is still going to be in contact with these 2 wires right here. But this is pretty light, so it's not going to matter. It can be suspended with these wires without any risk of damage. But what I found is that when I removed this one of these lever type springs had split. This one's in good shape, and this one had broken. The head of it had broken off. As a matter of fact, here it is right here. So the curved part had separated. So I have a decision point to make. Do I want to purchase this spring and put it back on here, which is definitely can be done. You just order it from Portline Hobby. It, excuse me, it just slides over that little tab right there, and you push it back, and you're done with it. The solder point of the wire is going to hold it on, so it won't come off. But I decided to go ahead and put a more modern brush bracket assembly on. This one must have come from maybe pre-war. I went and looked in the factory service manual for locomotive 322, Hudson 322, Hudson 320, and K5 Pacific 310. None of them, although they were from the 46-47 era, had in the factory service manual this particular brush bracket assembly shown. They all had this one shown in the exploded view, which leads me to believe these were precursors to this type. The years don't really matter, but I've got a feeling that A.C. Gilbert simply wanted to deplete the inventory of these, so they decided to keep on marching until they depleted this inventory and then switch over to this newer type. While we're on the subject, that lever type spring used what is called a slotted brush, and you can see in this brush the tiny slot in the top where the spring holds it in and applies the pressure to the commutator. But I'm just going to set those aside. I may or may not use them, but those are the type that go with this one, and I'm simply going to replace this one altogether. Now I'm going to go ahead and order the spring and put it back on here because I want to retain this brush bracket assembly. I went ahead and separated the wires, and all I'm going to do now in order to replace it is I'm going to put these brush caps, which I got out of my inventory of parts, at these two contact points here. Use this particular type of brush bracket assembly, which means the cap just clip over the ends here, and I drop in a different type of brush, which is called a shoulder brush. It's got that little offset on top that is kind of like a shoulder, and hence the name shoulder brushes. Now I think I'll go ahead and order some more shoulder brushes. These were actually used, and I'd like to put in new. I have two A.C. Gilbert springs that hold the brushes in, so I'm good to go. I can then reassemble all of this. One more item I failed to mention is that the reverse unit has wires leading to the headlamp socket and bracket that have to be disconnected. The solder points have to be separated in order to separate the reverse unit and, of course, this whole assembly. And that's easy to do. One wire goes to the base of the socket right there. As a matter of fact, there's a little loop contact point to put it in. And then the other one is just soldered to the outside of the bulb base. And that's it. I just broke those two solder points, or released them. I didn't break anything. I just released them. And then that allowed me to pick the reverse unit and the motor up as single units and literally just lift them up and set them down to continue the work, which was the separation of the motor. Again, I probably wouldn't have separated the motor except for the fact that I recognized that this spring had broken and I was going to have to do it. By the way, this is one, according to Hannon, this is one of the earliest armatures used. This one is XA9547 from 1946 and 47, hence it ends in the digits 47, maybe. I think it will still be serviceable. I have several of these in my inventory. I think I have 4. And what I mean by these is that these wide gap armatures that are considered what are called pre-pull-more tire armatures. Later on, you'll notice that these sections of the armature are pulled closer together. But this one appears to be one of the first ones. The only thing that concerns about it, it is clean. I re-cleaned it from the first time, but it has some pretty recognizable and deep grooves in the commutator, which I've never had a commutator that appears to be that worn. Now, I don't know if that was part of the manufacturing process or if in fact this train was run so much that the brushes actually wore that groove in there. And I'm going to try to probably go ahead initially and see how it works. Use these slotted brushes, which are newer and longer than these used shoulder brushes, and just let the springs hold those in, although they're intended to be held in by the lever type, which appeared in the earlier locomotives, and see if that works okay. And in the meantime, I'm going to order some spares of the shoulder type and probably go ahead and replace them and see how that works. So that should bring us to the point where we're going to take the next big step, and that's the replacement of the wheel.